Excellences, chers collègues, chers amis, for more than a decade, we have documented extensive human rights violations and war crimes across the Syrian territory by all parties to the conflict. There has been a consistent disregard for the lives and well-being of the Syrian people with no end in sight. The situation on the ground has grown more complex with a crumbling economy, a devastating humanitarian situation which has worsened due to the earthquake last year, increasing reliance on drug manufacturing and trade, and a state unwilling and, to a certain extent, unable to safeguard its people's safety and security. 6 foreign armies are engaged militarily in the country. Equally concerning is the deepening fragmentation of the country on all fronts, which will have considerable repercussions in the long term, including on Syria's fabric and unity. Appalling cycles of violence continue. In Sanamin Dera on 7th April, 10 civilians, including 2 children, were killed by a pro-government militia, reportedly in retaliation for an IED attack in which at least 7 children were killed. Massacres such as this invoke the atrocities committed with impunity during the conflict, including during the darkest day of Daesh rule, and 5 years after Daesh lost its territorial hold, we continue to document brutal attacks by Daesh elements in northeast and central Syria. Accountability and rule of law is also needed in opposition-held areas. We have received reports of recent positive steps in Syrian National Army, SNA, areas to hold armed group members accountable for serious violations of human rights law. However, at the same time, we continue to document cases of individual SNA members involved in torture and ill treatment of detainees in their custody. Madame la Vice-Présidente, while the tempo of the conflict has ebbed and flowed, the root causes that led to it are still very much present. From ongoing demonstrations calling for political reform and accountability in Sweden, in the south of the country, now in their 10th month, to demonstrations against Hayat Tahrir al-Sham authoritarian rule in Idlib, now in their 5th month, and the recent eruption of protests in North Aleppo, Syrians are calling for and deserve better. Across a divided Syria, we see predatory security forces and militias overseeing fiefdoms extorting monetary gain from civilians rather than ensuring protection and the rule of law. Incommunicado detention and enforced disappearance continue, with families of those unlawfully detained often compelled to pay large sums of money to try to obtain information on the fate of their loved ones. Syrian refugees recently returning from Lebanon have reportedly been detained and their whereabouts are now unknown. Drug trafficking and smuggling have spread with the involvement of pro- and anti-government factions, causing further insecurity. Unlawful occupation, confiscation, and destruction of homes, land, and properties of IDPs and refugees continue in a sort of slow motion but steady fashion, further eroding their rights and rendering the prospects of their return home more elusive every day. The long-running conflict and its consequences have thus become further entrenched. Impunity and lawlessness have shaped a green reality for all Syrians, with no end in sight. World leaders involved in the conflict in Syria are failing to achieve progress towards a peaceful settlement of the conflict. And they and the Syrian government are failing the Syrian people. The former UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mr. Martin Griffiths' recent observation that such failure, quote, is most evident in the leaders who, with such callous disregard for the consequence of their own people and others, remorselessly reach for the gun instead of pursuing diplomatic solutions, end of quote. Perfectly reflects the dynamics which drive the Syrian conflict. Excellence, The normalization track that some Arab states led last year and that saw Syria rejoin the League of Arab States has yet to bring results, as reportedly no further meaningful concessions were made by the Syrian government. Both the government and the international community seem bizarrely content to maintain the status quo in Syria. Yet, this is not a viable option for the Syrian people, whether inside and outside the country. Internally, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, torture and death in detention continue, while violence and insecurity plague different parts of the country and the economy flatlines. In neighboring countries, Syrians are increasingly at risk of deportation and forced return to Syria, where they risk being arrested or disappeared, or returning to find their homes and farms destroyed and no means of livelihood. Adding further complexity to this landscape is the risks posed by the Israel-Palestine conflict and the likelihood for further escalation in Syria and the region. More positively, outside the country, Syrian civil society has been leading highly creative accountability initiatives. These have led to the recent verdict in Paris, which found the 3 high-ranking Syrian officials guilty of complicity in crimes against humanity and war crimes against 2 French Syrian nationals killed in detention. They also include their active support to the International Court of Justice proceeding regarding Syrian state torture, which ruled for provisional measures in the case brought by Canada and the Netherlands against Syria for violations of the Convention Against Torture. We hope this will be the start for further steps to hold all perpetrators accountable. Another positive development was the long-awaited establishment of an institution dedicated to helping the families of the thousands of missing and disappeared uncover the fate of their loved ones. We are not naive about the challenges ahead, but we are very glad to see the voice of these families heard after many years of advocacy, which you supported from the very start. Madame la Vice-Présidente, Excellence, every time we address you here at the Council, and I'm doing this for the last 11 years, you ask us what more can you do to help the Syrian people. In addition to continuing to support accountability efforts and the institution for the missing, we would like to propose 3 critical areas where your government's actions is urgently needed. The first area is the situation of those detained arbitrarily since 2019 in northeast Syria. Some states are doing their best to repatriate their nationals. Those who have not needed to follow suit and bring their citizens home. Our policy paper this March dealt with the specific issue of the now 28,000 children arbitrarily detained in camps in the northeast. As for Syrians who originate in that area, they are gradually returning to their communities, albeit with a few challenges. But those who came from government-controlled areas are at a great risk if they are involuntarily returned there. Your government's help is needed in assisting the authorities in the northeast to find a solution for these Syrians too. The second is the imposition of unilateral coercive measures, UCM, by some of your government on Syria. It is now very clear there are seriously adverse, sometimes so-called unintended consequences that negatively impact the civilian population. The Secretary General's report of June last year described how humanitarian organizations face both increased costs in their procurement and delays in the delivery of goods and financial transactions due to complex UCM compliance assessment. We urge member states to conduct urgent reviews of their imposition of sanctions to ensure that these negative impacts are eliminated. Finally, it is the area is your government's alarming lack of support for the humanitarian response plan for 2024. I'd like to repeat that. The final area is your government's alarming lack of support for the humanitarian response plan for 2024. We are now at the halfway point and only 13%, I repeat, 13% of the $4.7 billion needed has been raised. We are aware that numerous other crises need attention, but the Syrian people cannot just be dropped because of this. They have endured 13 years of conflict, and they deserve much more help from your government. Merci infiniment. Thank you.